A dying child, a locked gate, a man with nothing left to lose. On the coldest night of 1887, Silas Boone stood in the Montana darkness with his 5-year-old daughter burning alive in his arms, and nowhere left to run. Behind him, 6 months of failure, starvation, and graves he couldn't stop digging in his mind. Ahead of him, one last gate, one last chance, one stranger who could slam a door and end everything. She didn't slam it. What happened next would shake an entire frontier to its bones. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain came sideways that night. It wasn't the gentle kind that farmers prayed for in dry summers. This was October rain in Montana, cold enough to bite, heavy enough to drown, the kind that didn't fall so much as attack. It hammered the frozen ground and turned dirt trails into rivers of black mud, and somewhere in the middle of all that darkness, a man named Silas Boone was still walking. He had been walking for 11 hours. His boots had split open along the left sole sometime around noon, and every step he took made a wet, sucking sound against the mud beneath him. His coat, a canvas duster that had once belonged to his father, hung heavy with water, and the weight of it pulled at his shoulders like a hand trying to drag him down. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because in his arms, wrapped in a horse blanket that had long since soaked through, was his daughter. Lila was 5 years old, and she weighed almost nothing. That scared him more than the rain did. She had been a solid child once, round-cheeked, heavy-footed, the kind of little girl who ran everywhere instead of walked, and who laughed so loud it embarrassed him in church. That was before the spring floods that took the lower field, before the bank letter that arrived in August with its flat, formal language that still somehow managed to destroy everything, before Clara. He didn't let himself think about Clara for long. He hadn't figured out how to do that yet without stopping in his tracks, and stopping was something he couldn't afford tonight. Lila stirred against his chest. Her forehead, pressed against his collarbone, was so hot it felt like a coal through the wet fabric of his shirt. "Papa." Her voice was barely there, scraped thin. "I'm here. Are we lost?" He almost laughed. Almost. "No," he said. "We're not lost." He had no idea where they were. He had followed the main road out of Dillon 3 days ago, heading north because someone at the supply store had mentioned a town called Briar Creek, where a man might find work on one of the big spreads before winter locked everything down. He had a rough direction and no map and 70 cents in his coat pocket. He had made worse starts than this. Or maybe he hadn't. He was having trouble remembering a time when things had been genuinely good, and that frightened him in a quiet, persistent way that was almost worse than panic. Panic at least had energy in it. What he felt now was something heavier. Lila coughed, a rattling, deep chest sound that had been getting worse since yesterday morning, and her whole small body shuddered with it. Silas pressed her tighter against him and kept moving. The trail had narrowed between 2 ridgelines, and the trees on either side were so thick they blocked what little moonlight the clouds occasionally surrendered. He was navigating mostly by instinct and by the faint, pale strip of mud beneath his feet. Then he saw the fence. It materialized out of the dark like something from a half-remembered dream. A post and rail fence running east to west, solid and well-maintained, the kind of fence that took serious money and serious labor to build out here. He followed it with his eyes and found, maybe 100 yards to the right, the shape of a gate. And beyond the gate, so far off it might have been a star that had fallen sideways, a light. He stood there for a moment, rain beating against the back of his neck, just looking at it. There was a version of himself. The version from 3 years ago, the version who still had a farm and a wife and some stubborn Montana pride, who would have hesitated, who would have weighed whether it was appropriate to show up at a stranger's gate at this hour, in this weather, looking like something a flood had spat out. That version of himself would have camped in the tree line and knocked at a decent hour in the morning. He walked toward the gate. It was padlocked. A heavy iron chain looped through the latch twice, the kind that said, "This is not accidental." Whoever owned this place had decided, deliberately and with some effort, that people would not simply wander in. Silas looked down at Lila. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were dry and cracked at the corners. He reached up and knocked on the wooden gatepost with his fist. 3 times, hard. Nothing. He knocked again, harder, until the sound of it cut through the rain. A dog somewhere beyond the light began to bark. He waited. The The cold had gotten into his hands so thoroughly that he could barely feel his fingers anymore, and he shifted Lila's weight to his left arm and breathed into his right fist, trying to bring some sensation back. She made a small sound, not words, just sound, and he said her name quietly. Lila, stay with me, sweetheart. Another minute passed. He was about to knock again when the light moved. It was a lantern, he realized. Someone had picked it up and was walking toward the gate. The light swung with the motion, throwing shadows that lurched and stretched across the mud yard beyond the fence. He could make out the shape of the person carrying it, small, moving quickly. A woman. She stopped on her side of the gate, holding the lantern up so the light fell on him. He could see her face now, 40 or so, dark hair pinned back and coming loose in the rain, wearing a wool coat thrown over what looked like a nightgown. Her eyes moved from his face to the bundle in his arms and stayed there. She's sick, Silas said. He hadn't planned anything more eloquent than that. The woman's jaw tightened. She looked at him again, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding something fast. And then she reached into her coat pocket and produced a key. Get inside, she said. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where he'd come from. She just unlocked the chain, swung the gate open, and turned back toward the house, expecting him to follow. He followed. Set. The house was larger than it had looked from outside. A two-story timber frame that had been built by someone who intended to stay, with a covered porch running the full width of the front and a stone chimney at the east end that was, mercifully, putting out real heat. The woman pushed through the front door and called out as she entered. Ruth, Ruth, bring the blankets from the chest, the wool ones, and put the kettle on right now. A girl of maybe 15 appeared at the top of the stairs, took one look at the situation, and disappeared without a word. The woman, Silas didn't know her name yet, pointed him toward an armchair near the fireplace. Sit her down there, close to the fire but not too close. He sat. He settled Lila into the chair and unwrapped the horse blanket from around her, and what he uncovered made his stomach drop. In the weeks since she'd gotten sick, he'd been telling himself she looked better than she did. Seeing her in proper lamplight, he couldn't do that anymore. Her color was wrong. Her breathing was shallow and too fast. The fever had done something to her face that he didn't have a word for. Pulled at it, somehow. Thinned it. His hands were shaking when he pulled them back. How long? The woman asked, crouching beside the chair. The cough started 4 days ago. Fever came on the second night. Has she eaten? Little bit. She threw most of it up yesterday. The woman pressed the back of her hand to Lila's forehead, her cheek, the side of her throat. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. I'm Evelyn Hawthorne, she said without looking up. This is my ranch, Silas Boone. He paused. I wouldn't have knocked at this hour if there was... I know, she said simply. Ruth reappeared with an armload of blankets and a basin of water. Behind her came an older woman, 60 at least, with the build of someone who had spent decades outdoors, carrying a wooden box that clinked with the sound of small glass bottles. This is May, Evelyn said. She's been handling sickness on this ranch for 20 years. You let her work. May didn't wait for his permission. She set her box down, opened it, and went to work with the efficient calm of someone who had done this 100 times. She packed cold cloths around Lila's neck and wrists, got a few drops of something from one of the bottles between the girl's barely parted lips, and spoke to her in a low, steady voice that Silas couldn't quite make out. He watched from 2 feet away and felt entirely useless. Evelyn appeared beside him and pressed a tin mug into his hands. He looked down at it. Coffee. Real coffee. Thick and hot. When did you last eat? She asked. He had to think about it. Yesterday. We had some hardtack and the last of the dried beef. She looked at him the same way she'd looked at Lila, measuring, assessing, without judgment. Sit down, Mr. Boone. You're swaying on your feet. I'm fine. You're about to fall over. She said it without any heat, just a fact. Sit down. He sat. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself he was keeping watch, but the truth was simpler than that. He didn't trust himself to close his eyes. Every time he started to drift, Lila would shift or make a sound and he'd snap back, hands tightening on the arms of the chair they'd moved him to against the far wall. May worked through the first few hours with the steady, methodical patience of someone following a ritual. She changed the cooling cloths every 20 minutes, coaxed more drops of whatever was in her bottles past Lila's lips at regular intervals, kept the fire at a specific, careful temperature. Evelyn came and went, checking in, speaking quietly with May, bringing more water from the kitchen. Neither of them talked to Silas much, which he was grateful for. He wasn't sure he had words right now. Around 3 in the morning, Lila's breathing changed. He noticed it before May did. A fractional deepening, the tight, shallow rhythm loosening just slightly. He leaned forward in his chair. May noticed him noticing and came over to check. She pressed her fingers lightly to the pulse point in Lila's wrist, held still, and then let out a slow breath through her nose. "Fever's breaking," she said. "Not gone, but moving in the right direction." Something happened in Silas's chest that he had no name for. It wasn't relief exactly. It was too raw for that, too close to the edge of something else. "She'll make it?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. May looked at him steadily. "She's not past it yet, but she's fighting. That's a tough little girl you've got." "Yeah," he said. "She is." He turned back to Lila. Her cheeks, which had been burning red for days, had eased toward something closer to pink. He reached out and put his hand over hers. Her whole hand fit in his palm with room to spare, and just held it there. By the time gray light started coming through the window, Evelyn was back in the room with a plate of biscuits and some sort of stew that must have been left over from the night before. She set it on the small table beside Silas without comment. He looked at the food, then at her. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know. I mean any of it. The gate, You didn't know me from Adam." Evelyn settled into the chair across from him, wrapping both hands around her own mug. She looked tired. Not the crumbling kind. Just the straightforward kind that came from being awake all night. "I saw a man standing in the rain holding a sick child," she said. "That's all I needed to know about you." Silas looked at the plate again. He picked up the biscuit and ate it in 2 bites, and then he ate everything else. And when he was done, he put the plate down and stared at the floor. "I had a farm," he said. Not to explain himself. Just because somewhere around 4 in the morning he'd decided that this woman deserved the truth about who she'd let through her gate. "South of Dillon, 40 acres, good soil. Or I thought it was good. The river flooded 3 years in a row. First flood, I borrowed to fix the irrigation. Second flood, I borrowed to replant. Third flood," he stopped. "Bank came in August." Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. "My wife passed last winter. Fever took her fast. Doc said it was her lungs." He paused. "After the bank took the farm, I didn't know what else to do but move. Heard there might be work up north. Started walking. With your daughter. She's all I've got." The room was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Across the room, Lila's breathing was slow and even, the most peaceful sound Silas had heard in months. "There's a bunkhouse out back," Evelyn said. "It's not much, but it's dry and it's warm, and if you want, it's yours until your daughter's back on her feet." She paused. "I'm not a charity operation, Mr. Boone. I run this ranch with 4 men right now, and there's more work than 4 men can do before winter. If you want to earn your keep, I'll put you to work. If you don't, no hard feelings. You can rest up and move on when Lila's ready." He looked at her across the firelight, at the steady way she held herself, the practical set of her mouth, the absence of anything that looked like pity. "I know ranching," he said. "I figured. I can work horses, I can do fencing, irrigation, whatever you need." "Good." She stood. "Get some sleep first. You're no use to anyone half dead." She picked up the empty plate and headed for the kitchen, and Silas watched her go. Outside, the rain had stopped sometime while he wasn't paying attention. Through the window, he could see the first pale smear of dawn coming up over the eastern ridge. He looked at Lila. She was sleeping with her mouth slightly open, the way she always slept, one small hand curled up near her cheek. The terrible heat that had poured off her for days had dropped to something that felt almost normal. May was dozing in the chair beside her, the wooden box of medicines at her feet. For the first time in a very long time, Silas Boone sat in a warm room with his daughter breathing easily beside him, and he let himself put the weight of it down. Just for a minute. Just the smallest piece of it. The farm, the bank, Clara's grave, the long months of moving and failing and running out of everything. He set it down like a pack he'd been carrying and rolled his shoulders back, and the ache of it spread through his chest and up his throat and pressed behind his eyes. He didn't cry. He was too tired to cry. But he sat there in the firelight with his daughter's hand in his, and the dawn came up pink and cold over the Montana ridge, and it was enough. It was, he thought, just barely enough to keep going. Lila ate her first real meal on the third morning. It wasn't much. Half a bowl of oatmeal with a little honey stirred in, and a cup of warm milk that May insisted on. But she ate it sitting up in the armchair with a blanket pulled to her chin. And when she was done, she looked around the room with the careful, wondering eyes of someone who has been somewhere very far away and has only just found their way back. "Papa," she said, "this house smells like bread." Silas was sitting on a stool 2 feet away, elbows on his knees. He'd been watching her eat with the focused attention of a man who'd been told not to hover, but couldn't help himself. "It does," he agreed. "Our house used to smell like bread." He didn't say anything to that. He just reached over and tucked the blanket more firmly around her legs. Evelyn appeared in the doorway with a fresh mug of something hot, took in the empty bowl on the side table, and permitted herself a small nod. "Good," she said. "She can try the porch tomorrow if the weather holds." "She'll want to," Silas said. "She doesn't sit still well." "Neither do I." Evelyn set the mug down and looked at him directly. "You've been in that chair for 3 days, Mr. Boone. Tom can show you the bunkhouse this afternoon. There's a spare bunk at the end, been empty since September." "I don't want to leave her." "She's not going anywhere. May will be here." Evelyn's voice wasn't unkind, but it didn't leave a lot of room for argument either. "You said you could work. I've got a section of the north fence that came down in the last storm, and 3 horses that came in from the high pasture so spooked they won't let anyone in the stall with them. Winter's 6 weeks out, maybe less. I need you functional, not folded up in that chair." Silas looked at Lila. She was already starting to droop again. The meal had used up most of what she had. "Go, Papa," she murmured without opening her eyes. "I'm fine." He stood up. His back screamed at him. "All right," he said. "Done." The bunkhouse was a low timber building set 30 yards behind the main house, close enough to the stable that you could hear the horses at night. Inside there were 6 bunks, a potbelly stove that threw more heat than it had any right to, a scarred wooden table, and 4 men who looked up from what they were doing when Silas ducked through the door. Tom Reedy was the foreman, a compact, weathered man in his late 40s with a gray beard trimmed close and a permanent squint from 20 years of working in the Montana sun. He shook Silas's hand without excessive warmth and pointed to the empty bunk at the far end. The other 3 men were younger. Danny, who was barely 20 and talked too much, Edgar, who talked almost never, and a man everyone called Coop, whose real name Silas didn't learn for 2 weeks. "You the one came in through the gate in the storm?" Danny asked. "That's right." "Mrs. Hawthorne said you know horses." "Some." Danny leaned back on his bunk. "Edgar said you were probably a drifter or an outlaw. I said you were probably just broke." "Danny," Tom said without heat. "What?" "I'm not wrong." Danny looked at Silas with the uncomplicated directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be subtle about it. "Are you broke?" "Was," Silas said. He set his pack down on the empty bunk. "Working on the past tense." Tom made a sound that might have been approval. He started on the north fence the next morning before full light. It was the kind of work that asked nothing from your head and everything from your body. Pulling collapsed posts from frozen ground, resetting them straight, stretching wire until your palms bled through the leather gloves. Tom came out to check on him around mid-morning and found 3 sections already done and Silas moving on to the 4th without any sign of slowing. Tom stood there for a minute watching him work. "You set fence before?" he asked. "Set plenty of it. On my own place." Silas drove the post another 2 inches with the back of the maul. "Before I didn't have a place anymore." Tom nodded slowly. That seemed to be enough information for him. By the end of the first week, Silas had finished the north fence, repaired the water trough in the east corral, and replaced the rotted boards on the stable's south wall that had been letting cold air straight through to the stalls. He worked without being asked twice and without complaining about what he found, which on a ranch that had been running 4 men short all season was considerable. The horses were a different matter. There were 3 of them, a roan mare, a gray gelding, and a young buckskin that was the real problem. They'd come in from the high pasture in September after something had spooked the whole string, and whatever had scared them up there had burned itself into their nervous system so thoroughly that the buckskin in particular would throw himself against the stall walls if a man came within 6 feet of the door. Silas spent the better part of 3 days just sitting outside the stall, not pushing, not reaching through the bars, just sitting on a bucket with his back against the wall and his presence filling the space, letting the animal get used to the fact that he wasn't a threat. Tom walked past on the second day and gave him a look that suggested this was not how they'd been approaching the problem. "You're just going to sit there?" "For now." "That buckskin put Edgar through a wall last month. Edgar probably moved too fast." Tom grunted and walked on. On the 4th day, the buckskin stopped throwing himself at the walls. On the 6th, he came to the front of the stall and breathed at Silas through the bars. By the end of the 2nd week, Silas was in the stall with him, moving slow, talking low and steady, nothing dramatic about it. The horse was still wired tight, still flinched at sudden sounds, but he wasn't dangerous anymore. He was just scared, and scared Silas understood. "How'd you do that?" Danny asked, watching from the stable door. Silas came out of the stall and latched it behind him. "I just waited him out." Tom said the last man who tried to gentle that horse quit after 2 days. "I didn't have anywhere else to be." Lila recovered the way children do, faster than seemed possible, and all at once. By the end of the 2nd week, she was following May around the kitchen with the determined attention of a 5-year-old who has decided that this woman is the most interesting person she has ever met. May, who had no patience for most adults and limited patience for most children, somehow found herself explaining the medicinal properties of dried yarrow and the correct way to strain broth to an audience of one small girl who nodded very seriously and asked questions May actually had to think about to answer. "Your daughter asked me this morning why we can't just boil the sickness out of a person," May told Silas one evening, passing him in the yard. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was a good question." May paused. "It is a good question." Silas watched Lila through the kitchen window, where she was standing on a stool to reach the counter and very carefully stirring something in a pot while May supervised. Something shifted in his chest, something that had been locked down tight for a long time. He hadn't seen Lila happy in months. He hadn't fully realized how much he'd missed it yet. It was Tom who first mentioned Granger. They were riding the eastern fence line on a gray Wednesday morning, checking for damage before the next round of cold weather moved in, when Tom reined up at the top of a low rise and looked out across the valley to the east. About 2 miles out, a cluster of buildings sat behind a substantial fence, bigger than Hawthorne's, newer, the kind of construction that announced money without needing to say it directly. "That's the Granger spread," Tom said. "You'll want to know about him." Silas studied the buildings. "Why?" "Because he's been trying to buy Mrs. Hawthorne's east pasture for 3 years, and she keeps telling him no, and every time she tells him no, he finds a different way to make her life difficult." Tom's voice was flat. Not dramatic, just matter of fact, the way men talked about weather or bad ground, something that just was. He started with the offers, kept raising them. She kept refusing. Then last spring, some of our cattle went missing out of the east pasture, about 20 head never found. Then the buyer we'd been working with in Briar Creek suddenly didn't want our beef anymore, didn't give a reason, didn't have to, and that was Granger. Can't prove it, never could. Tom turned his horse back toward the fence line. "Man's careful. That's what makes him worse than the other kind." Silas took one more look at the Granger spread before following. The buildings were well kept, the fencing precise. From up here it all looked perfectly orderly. "Has he come to the ranch directly?" Silas asked. "Twice. Once about 8 months ago with 2 of his men and a new offer, higher than anything before. Mrs. Hawthorne heard him out on the porch and then told him the east pasture wasn't for sale and to please get off her property." Tom almost smiled at the memory. "Second time was about 4 months back. He came alone, no hands, all politeness. Asked if she'd at least consider leasing the grazing rights. She told him the same thing she'd told him the first time, just with less pleas. Silas could picture it. He'd spent enough time around Evelyn Hawthorne by now to have a reasonably accurate picture of what that conversation would have looked like. "He won't stop," Tom said. It wasn't a question. "No," Tom agreed. "He won't stop." The first real trouble arrived on a Thursday evening in early November. Silas was in the stable doing a last check before dark, when Tom came in moving faster than his usual deliberate walk, and Silas could read from 10 feet away that something was wrong. "We're short 8 head from the south pasture," Tom said. "Went to close the gate for the night and counted wrong twice before I believed it." They rode out with lanterns and found what they found. A section of fence cut clean, the wire ends neat and curled back in a way that didn't happen by accident. The cattle were gone into the dark and the cold, and there were enough tracks in the mud around the cut fence to suggest at least 3 horses had come through, but after 50 yards the trail scattered on hard ground and went nowhere useful. Tom held his lantern over the cut wire and said nothing for a long moment. "Same as last spring?" Silas asked. "Same as last spring." They rode back to the house, and Tom delivered the news to Evelyn in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with what looked like the ranch's account book spread in front of her, and she listened without interrupting, her pen held still above the page. When Tom finished, she set the pen down. "How many?" she asked. 8 head. Could be more when we get a full count in the morning." She was quiet for a moment. Her jaw worked slightly. "Send word to the sheriff in Briar Creek tomorrow morning, and check every fence line this week. I want to know if anywhere else has been touched." "Yes, ma'am." Tom went out, and Silas, who had been standing near the door, started to follow. "Mr. Boone." He stopped. Evelyn was looking at the account books, not at him. "What's your read on it?" He considered that. Wire doesn't cut itself that neat. Someone who knew what they were doing and who knew where the south pasture fence ran in the dark. "Someone who's been on this land before," she said, "or who's had it described to him in detail." She finally looked up. Her expression was controlled, but there was something behind it. Not fear, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been waiting for a particular blow to land and has just felt it. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer," she said. "All right? You've been here 3 weeks. You've worked hard, and I've got no complaints. But I don't know where you were before Dylan, and I don't know what you left behind. If there's anything that would bring trouble to this ranch, I need to hear it now." The question sat between them. It was fair. He'd have asked the same thing. "There's nothing," he said. "I had a farm. I lost it. I have a daughter and a split boot and 70 cents I've mostly spent. That's the full inventory." She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she said, and went back to her books. The rumors started 2 weeks later. Silas heard the first one from Danny, who'd ridden into Briar Creek for supplies and come back quieter than usual. "What?" Silas asked, because Danny was never quiet without a reason. Danny put down the grain sacks he was carrying and didn't quite meet his eyes. "People in town are saying things." "What kind of things?" "That you left Dylan ahead of a warrant. That you had some trouble with a man's cattle down south." Danny finally looked at him. "I don't believe it. I'm just telling you what I heard." Silas stood with that for a moment. "Who's saying it?" It's around. You know how it gets around." He knew exactly how it got around. You started it in one place with one person, and it moved from there the way fire moved, fast and in whatever direction the wind was blowing. He went to Evelyn that evening and told her what Danny had said. She listened with the same stillness she brought to everything. "Have you had trouble with anyone's cattle?" she asked. "No." "Is there a warrant out of Dylan?" "No." "Then that's my answer." She pulled on her coat, getting ready for the evening walk she made around the yard every night. "People can say whatever they want. I know what I see on this ranch." "It could hurt you," Silas said, "harboring a man with that kind of talk attached to him. It could affect your business, the buyers you deal with." "Mr. Boone." She stopped buttoning her coat and looked at him. "I've been running this ranch since my husband died 4 years ago. I have dealt with bad weather, bad debt, a foreman who drank, and Victor Granger. I'm not going to fold because of gossip." She finished the last button. "But thank you for telling me." She went out, and he watched her cross the yard in the dark, her breath clouding in the cold air, her stride even and unhurried, and he thought that she was probably the stubbornest person he had ever met. He meant it without any qualification as the straightest compliment he could think of. November deepened, and the work didn't slow. If anything, it compacted. The pressing weight of winter preparation added to whatever time the investigation into the missing cattle was eating. The sheriff's deputy had come out from Briar Creek, looked at the cut fence, written things down in a notebook, and gone back to town without any indication that he believed anything useful would come of it. More cattle went missing in the third week of November. 6 head this time, from the north pasture. Then a section of the newly repaired north fence came down again. Not storm damage, Tom confirmed. Cut, same as before. Then the livestock started getting sick. It began with 2 of the older steers showing symptoms that May couldn't immediately identify. Muscle weakness, a specific kind of distress that made them stand with their legs splayed and their heads low. By the time she'd figured out what she was looking at, 3 more animals had shown the same signs. Poisoned, she said to Evelyn, and her voice was flat and hard in a way Silas hadn't heard from her before. Water trough in the East Corral. Something was put in it. The East Corral. The pasture Victor Granger had been trying to buy for 3 years. Evelyn stood in the corral with her arms folded and looked at the sick animals in the trough, and for a moment her face showed everything she was holding. The exhaustion of it, the injustice, the grinding relentlessness of being a target. Then she pulled it back in, all of it, the way a person closes a door. "Pull the trough," she said. "Fresh water from the well only until we figure out where else might be compromised." Silas watched her walk back to the house. He stood in the cold for another minute, looking east toward where the Granger spread sat 2 miles away, solid and orderly and untouchable. He thought about Tom's words from weeks ago. Man's careful. That's what makes him worse than the other kind. He understood that now in a way he hadn't when he first heard it. The worst thing about a careful enemy wasn't the damage they did. It was the certainty it produced. The absolute bone-deep certainty that it was them, that it was deliberate, that every blow was aimed and measured, and the absolute inability to prove any of it. That night, after Lila was asleep in the room May had set up for her off the kitchen, Silas sat at the bunkhouse table while the other men slept and turned it over in his mind. He thought about the cattle and the fence and the poisoned trough. He thought about the rumors circulating in Briar Creek with his name attached to them. He thought about the pattern of it, the slow, methodical escalation, each move just far enough past the last one. He thought about what came next, if the pattern held. He wasn't sure yet, but he was sure of one thing. Whatever Victor Granger was building toward, he was building toward it carefully and with patience, and he wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted or until something or someone stopped him first. Outside the bunkhouse window, the Montana winter pressed in close and silent, and somewhere in the main house a light was still burning. Evelyn, still up, still working at those account books, still refusing to give an inch. Silas put his elbows on the table and pressed his palms against his face and sat there in the dark, thinking about what it meant to have something worth protecting. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He hadn't had anything worth the thought. He had it now. The barn burned on a Friday night. Silas smelled it before he saw it. That particular wrongness in cold air, smoke that had no business being there at that hour. He came off his bunk in the dark and was through the bunkhouse door before he'd fully processed what his body already knew. The sky above the main stable was the color of a wound, orange-red and pulsing, and the sound of it hit him next. Not the roar people described in stories, but something lower, more methodical, a deep crackling consumption that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Fire!" He was already running. "Tom, fire in the barn!" The next 20 minutes were the kind that compressed into fragments later. Tom and Edgar hitting the yard at a dead sprint. Coop with a bucket, then another. The horses were the first priority, always, and Silas hit the stable doors with his shoulder and felt the heat push back at him like a hand against his chest. The roan mare was screaming. He went in anyway. He got the roan. He got the gray gelding. He was back for the buckskin when part of the loft came down and Tom caught him by the arm and physically hauled him out into the yard. "He's out!" Tom shouted over the noise. "Edgar got him out the side door. Stop!" Silas stopped. He stood in the frozen yard with burning debris falling around him and watched the barn go. There was nothing else to do. They didn't have enough water and they didn't have enough men, and the structure was already gone at its heart. All they could do was keep the fire from jumping to the stable or the main house. It took 2 hours to make sure of that. By the time the barn was down to its foundation, charred timber and ash steaming in the cold air, every man on the ranch was black-faced and hollow-eyed and shaking. Lila was on the porch of the main house, wrapped in a blanket, May's arm around her watching. When Silas finally walked across the yard toward her, she reached out both arms the way she used to when she was very small, and he went up the porch steps and held her without speaking. Evelyn was standing at the edge of the porch looking at what was left of her barn. Her face in the fading firelight was something Silas couldn't read and didn't try to. "The horses?" she asked. "All out," Tom said from the yard. "We got all of them." She nodded once, very slightly. Tit-tit. Sheriff Len Purcell rode in from Briar Creek the following afternoon. A tall man, angular, with a careful way of speaking that suggested he measured words the way other men measured whiskey. He walked the burn site with Tom and Silas, crouching occasionally to look at something in the ash, asking questions in the patient, unhurried manner of someone who already suspected the answer wasn't going to be simple. "Any lanterns left burning in the barn last night?" he asked. "We don't leave lanterns burning," Tom said. "Any chance someone forgot?" "We don't leave lanterns burning," Tom repeated, and his voice was the same both times, but something in it had changed slightly. Purcell looked at Silas. "And you are—" "Silas Boone. I've been working the ranch since October." "Before that?" "South of Dillon. I had a farm." Purcell wrote something in his notebook. He had a habit of writing things down without looking at what he was writing, his eyes still on the person in front of him. Silas found it faintly unsettling. "Reason you left Dillon?" "Bank took the farm. I had nowhere left to be." "Anyone in Dillon who could speak to your character?" Silas looked at him steadily. "Probably some who would, and some who wouldn't. Same as anywhere." Purcell nodded and wrote something else. He thanked Evelyn for her time, promised he'd look into it, and rode back toward town. Tom watched him go. "He'll look into it," he said. "You don't sound convinced," Silas said. "Purcell's a decent man, but Victor Granger has been a major taxpayer in this county for 15 years, and decent men have their limits." They started rebuilding the barn the following week. There wasn't a choice about the timing. With winter already past its first hard frosts, the horses needed covered shelter and they needed it before the next serious cold front moved through. Evelyn hired 2 men from Briar Creek to help with the heavy framing, and Silas worked alongside Tom from first light to last. And in the evenings when the cold drove them inside, he found himself at the kitchen table across from Evelyn, going over what they needed, what they had, and the considerable distance between those two things. It was in those evenings that he came to understand something about her that the daytime didn't show as clearly. During the day, she was efficient and decisive and absorbed. A manager, a rancher, someone with a list of problems to solve before dark. But in the evenings, when the work had been set down and there was nothing left but the accounting of it, something more complicated showed through. The cost of it. The weight of running a thing alone that had been built for 2 people, maintaining it, defending it, refusing to be moved from it. Her husband Robert had died 4 years ago. A horse that had spooked on a rock crossing. A fall that should have been survivable and wasn't. She mentioned him rarely and without decoration. Not because she'd stopped grieving, Silas suspected, but because she'd learned to carry it the way you carried anything you couldn't put down. You just incorporated it into your gait and kept walking. "You ever think about selling?" he asked one night. He didn't know why he asked it. It came out before he'd properly decided to say it. She looked up from the ledger. "Why would I think about that?" "I don't mean to Granger. I mean at all. Starting over somewhere that wasn't," he gestured vaguely, "all of this." "This is Robert's ranch," she said. Not defensive, just stating it. "He broke this ground. He built the first structure on it with 2 hired men and a borrowed team. Everything that came after was built on top of that." She looked back at the ledger. "I'm not selling it. I'm not leaving it. Whatever Granger throws at it, that's not changing." Silas thought about his own farm south of Dillon, the 40 acres he'd also broken and built on and then lost. He thought about the difference between walking away from something because you chose to and walking away because everything had been stripped from you, and how you were a different person depending on which one it was. "I understand that," he said. She glanced at him. "I know you do." Perhaps. The witness came forward on a Tuesday morning in December. His name was Pete Hadley, and Silas had seen him once or twice in Briar Creek without knowing who he was. A lean man in his 30s with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the kind of man who occupied the edges of rooms. He went to Sheriff Purcell and stated, calmly and with apparent confidence, that on the night of the barn fire, he had been on the road that ran along Hawthorne Ranch's eastern fence and had seen Silas Boone walking away from the barn property with a lantern, approximately 1 hour before the fire was discovered. Purcell rode out that afternoon. Silas was in the half-rebuilt barn when Tom came to find him, and he knew from Tom's face before a word was said that something had shifted in a direction that couldn't be walked back easily. "Sheriff's here," Tom said. "He wants to talk to you." Silas put down the board he was holding. He took a breath, the way a man does when he sees a thing coming and there's no point in running from it. Purcell was on the porch with Evelyn. He had the notebook out. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I've got a witness who places you near the east side of the barn on the night of the fire." "That witness is lying," Silas said. "He was pretty specific about what he saw." "Then he's specifically lying." "Where were you that night, before you came out of the bunkhouse?" "In my bunk, asleep until I smelled the smoke." "Anyone who can confirm that?" Silas paused. The bunkhouse was dark and silent at that hour. Danny slept like something dead. Edgar and Coop had their bunks at the far end with a dividing wall between. Tom had been in the foreman's separate quarters. "Not that can swear to it," he said. Purcell looked at him with something that might have been regret and might have been professional caution. "I'm going to have to ask you to come into town with me, Mr. Boone, just to answer some questions formally." "He's not going anywhere." Evelyn's voice was flat and absolute. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I said he's not going anywhere, Len. This man has worked this ranch for 2 months. He's never given me a moment of trouble, and you're taking a lying witness's word over the testimony of everyone on this property?" "I'm not taking anyone's word over anyone else's. I'm following a formal statement." "A formal statement from who? Who is this witness?" "I'm not at liberty to—" "Pete Hadley," Tom said from behind Silas. Everyone looked at him. Tom's expression hadn't changed. "I saw Hadley in town last week going into the Granger land office. Hadley does odd work for whoever's paying. He's done it before." Purcell wrote something down. His face gave nothing away. "Mr. Boone," he said again, "I need you to come with me. If everything's clear, you'll be back by tomorrow." Silas looked at Evelyn. She was holding herself very still, the same way she'd stood looking at the ruins of her barn, like she was absorbing something that hurt and refusing to show it. "It's all right," he said to her. "It's not all right," she said quietly. "I know, but I'll go." He looked at Purcell. "Let me say goodbye to my daughter." But Lila was in the kitchen with May, and when Silas came through the door with his coat and his hat, she read his face the way children read their parents, immediately and without ambiguity. "Where are you going?" Her voice was careful. She'd used that careful voice since the night he'd carried her through the rain gate, like she'd learned not to ask questions too loudly in case the answer was something she couldn't hold. "Into town for a bit," he said. He crouched down in front of her. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Is it because of the fire?" He looked at her. 5 years old, and she already knew that things connected to other things in ways that weren't always fair. He thought about lying. He didn't. "Someone's saying I did something I didn't do," he said. "So I have to go talk to the sheriff and straighten it out." Lila chewed her bottom lip. It was something she did when she was trying not to cry. "You'll come back," she said. Not a question, a demand. "I'll come back." She threw both arms around his neck and held on for a moment, and he held her back, and then he stood up before either of them had to look at each other's faces. May caught his eye over Lila's head. Her expression was hard and certain. "We'll be here," she said. Quote, "The jail in Briar Creek was a 2-room structure attached to the sheriff's office. Stone walls, 2 cells separated by iron bars, a small window set high in the back wall that let in a pale rectangle of winter sky." Purcell was not unkind. He brought food in the evening, explained the formal charge, arson based on Hadley's sworn statement, and said with what seemed like genuine discomfort that bail would be set in the morning when Judge Alderman was available. Silas sat on the cot and looked at the high window until the rectangle of sky went from gray to black. He thought about the sequence of it, the cattle stolen, the fence cut, the livestock poisoned, the rumors seeded in town, and now this. Not harassment, not pressure, but a criminal charge with a sworn witness, the kind of thing that stuck to a man even after it was disproved. Even if Evelyn could pay the bail, even if the charge eventually fell apart, the fact of it would follow him. The town had already been primed to doubt him. A formal arrest would settle something in their minds that no acquittal could fully unseat. Granger had planned this. The thought arrived not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something he'd been assembling for weeks. The escalation had been too precise, too patient, too aware of how things worked, not just on the ranch, but in the county, in the town, in the particular social mechanics of a frontier community where a man's reputation was the only currency that really mattered. Granger knew all of that. He'd been operating in that space for 15 years. And somewhere underneath all of it, Silas was increasingly certain there was something more than the East pasture. Granger wanted that land badly enough to do all of this, and men didn't want land that badly just for the grazing. He didn't sleep much. Chut. Evelyn Hawthorne did not go home after Silas was taken. She rode straight from the ranch to Briar Creek and spent the evening in the public records office on the main street, a narrow room with poor light and floor-to-ceiling shelves of county filings. The clerk, a small man named Abner, who was very clearly ready to close up and go home, found himself instead pulled into locating property surveys, county commission meeting minutes, and territorial land filings going back 4 years. Evelyn had been thinking about what Tom said, that Granger had been seen at his own land office, and that Hadley was the kind of man who worked for whoever was paying. She'd been thinking about Granger's persistence, about the particular stubbornness of it, the fact that a man of his resources could have simply moved his ambitions elsewhere, but hadn't. She'd been thinking about what made a piece of Montana ranch land worth committing crimes over. She found it in a territorial commission filing dated 14 months ago, a route survey, the kind that preceded major infrastructure decisions. She read it twice. Then she sat very still with the paper in her hands and felt the shape of the whole thing settle into place around her. A railroad. The Great Northern Expansion had filed a preliminary route survey that placed a likely corridor directly through the eastern portion of Hawthorne Ranch. The filing was public record, but buried in the kind of administrative language and cross-reference documents that a person wouldn't find unless they knew to look or unless someone had told them. Granger knew. He'd known for over a year. That was why the offers had been escalating, not just for grazing land, but for land that would be worth 5 or 10 times its current value the moment a railroad right-of-way was confirmed through it. That was why he couldn't let it go. That was why he'd moved from offers to pressure to sabotage to arson to false witness. Each step a calculated escalation because the prize at the end was not just a pasture, it was a fortune. Evelyn folded the survey document carefully and put it in her coat. She asked Abner for 2 more things before she let him close up: the property transfer records for any land Granger had acquired in the past 2 years, and any records of Pete Hadley's name appearing in county filings. Abner, who was by now convinced this woman was not going to leave until she had what she needed, produced both. The property records showed Granger quietly acquiring parcels along the same general corridor as the railroad survey. Small pieces, scattered, each transaction individually unremarkable, but collectively pointing in one direction like a compass finding north. Hadley's name appeared once, in a dispute record from 18 months ago. He had filed a complaint against a man in the county to the south, claiming the man owed him money for work performed. The defendant in that dispute was listed as an employee of the Granger land operation. Evelyn stood outside the records office in the dark Montana street and breathed cold air and organized what she had. It wasn't proof of arson, it wasn't proof of witness tampering or cattle theft or poison in a water trough. What it was motive, documented, specific, traceable motive. And she had the beginning of a thread connecting Hadley to Granger's payroll. She needed more. She knew she needed more, but it was enough to start with, and starting was what she was good at. She didn't go to see Silas that night. It was past the hour Purcell allowed visitors, and she wasn't going to accomplish anything by standing outside a jail in the dark. She rode back to the ranch, sat at the kitchen table with May's coffee and her own scattered notes, and thought about who in this county knew Victor Granger's business and might be willing to say so. It was a short list, but it wasn't an empty one. The bail hearing in the morning lasted 11 minutes. Judge Alderman was a heavy-set man in his 60s who had been on the bench in Briar Creek for 20 years and had developed, over that time, a manner of conducting proceedings that suggested he had somewhere more interesting to be. He set bail at an amount that made Silas's stomach drop, more than he'd ever had, in one place at one time. He He was standing in the courtroom trying to calculate what he could offer against it, when Evelyn walked through the door. She had clearly not slept. She was wearing the same coat as the day before, her hair pinned up with less precision than usual, and there was something in her eyes that Silas recognized. The look of someone who has been working through the night on a problem and has decided they've gotten enough of it solved to move. She spoke quietly to Purcell for 2 minutes. Then she walked to the judge's clerk and placed a folded document on the table. The bail was posted. Silas didn't ask where she'd gotten it. Outside the courthouse, in the pale December cold, he stood next to her on the board sidewalk and looked at the street. "You shouldn't have," he started. "Stop." She pulled her coat tighter. "I found something last night, in the county records." She told him about the railroad survey, about the land acquisitions, about Hadley's name in the dispute filing. She told it quickly and in order, the way she did everything, no drama in the presentation. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The street was mostly empty at this hour, a few horses at the hitching post in front of the general store, a dog moving along the opposite boardwalk with the purposeful air of an animal with somewhere to be. He knew about the railroad for over a year, Silas said. At least. And he couldn't get the land, so he decided to take it by destroying everything around it until you had no choice. That's what it looks like. He turned it over. The charge doesn't go away just because he had a motive. Hadley's statement is still on record. "I know that." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the edge underneath it. "I'm going to find someone who knows what Hadley was paid to do and is willing to say so in front of a judge. That's the next part." She paused. "It might take time we don't have." "The trial date?" 6 weeks. She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to let this stand, Silas." It was the first time she'd used his first name without the Mr. in front of it. He noticed that without knowing what to do with it. "I know," he said. They stood there on the cold sidewalk for another moment, the weight of what was coming settling between them. 6 weeks, a courtroom, a man with money and patience, and a bought witness. And against all of that, one woman with a county filing and a list of names and the specific unyielding refusal to let someone take what was hers. The morning light caught the frost on the street and made it look briefly like something worth looking at. Silas picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it against his side and put it back on. "I need to get back," he said. "Lila's been waiting since yesterday." "Then let's go home," Evelyn said. They walked to where the horses were tied, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the word hung in the cold air between them, the whole ride back. Home, simple and plain and carrying more weight than either of them was quite ready to examine in the full light of morning. The 6 weeks before trial were the longest of Silas's life, and that was saying something considerable given the year he'd had. He worked. That was what he did with the waiting. He turned it into labor, the same way he'd turned grief into fence posts and anger into horse gentling back in those first weeks. The new barn went up board by board in the December cold. And when the barn was done, he moved to everything else that needed doing, which on a ranch that had been under siege for months was considerable. He didn't talk about the trial much. He didn't see the point in talking about something he had no control over, and he'd learned enough about himself by now to know that talking about helplessness just made it heavier. Lila knew something was wrong in the way children always knew. Not the specifics, but the temperature of things. She'd taken to sleeping with a small piece of braided rope that May had made her, something to hold in her hand at night, and Silas had found it twisted into knots more than once in the mornings. He didn't comment on it. He just made sure he was there every night to tuck her in, and every morning when she woke up, and in whatever hours in between the work allowed. Evelyn, meanwhile, was fighting. She'd always been fighting, in the sense that running the ranch under Granger's campaign required constant resistance. But in those 6 weeks before the trial, she fought differently, with paper and with people, with the specific grinding persistence of someone who had a narrow window and knew it. She rode to Briar Creek 3 times a week. She wrote letters. She made appointments with men who were professionally cautious and who spoke in the careful language of people who had learned that certainty was expensive. She came home late and left early and pushed herself in a way that even May, who was not given to excessive concern for adults, started watching with a careful eye. The thread she'd pulled in the county records office kept unraveling, but not in a straight line. The land acquisitions she'd found, the parcels Granger had been quietly buying along the railroad corridor, led her to a land agent in the county seat named Forsyth, who was not Granger's agent but who had been involved in some of the same transactions from the other side. Forsyth was a small, precise man who wore his nervousness openly, like a garment he'd forgotten to take off. He knew more than he was initially willing to say. Evelyn sat across from him in his office for an hour the first time and came away with almost nothing. The second time she brought Tom. Tom didn't threaten anyone. He just sat in the corner of Forsyth's office with his arms folded and looked at the man with the patient, weathered expression of someone who had been in Montana long enough to have seen most things and was not easily impressed by any of them. Forsyth talked more during that second meeting. He told them that Granger's land agent had approached him 14 months ago about acquiring the Hawthorne East pasture through a third party, an arrangement that would obscure Granger's involvement. Forsyth had declined. But in the course of those conversations, Granger's agent had been indiscreet enough to mention the reason: the railroad survey, the right-of-way projection, the staggering difference between current land values and what the corridor would be worth once the route was confirmed. "Would you say that in court?" Evelyn asked him. Forsyth looked pained. "Mrs. Hawthorne, Victor Granger has been a significant— Would you say it in court?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside his window, Briar Creek went about its business in the winter cold. "If I were subpoenaed," he said carefully, "I would answer questions truthfully." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and Evelyn had learned in the past weeks to work with what she had. The connection to Pete Hadley took longer and came from an unexpected direction. Danny, young Danny, who talked too much and noticed everything because of it, came to Silas one afternoon in the second week of January with the air of someone who had been carrying something for a while and had finally decided to put it down. "You know I go into Briar Creek on Saturdays," Danny said. "I know. There's a woman I see there." He said it with the slightly defensive tone of someone preemptively managing judgment. "Her name's Cora. She works at the laundry on 2nd Street. It's been a few months." "Danny," Silas said, "I don't care about your personal life. What is it?" "Cora's brother works at the Granger spread, in the stable." Danny pushed his hands into his coat pockets. He told Cora, and Cora told me, that the week before the barn fire, Hadley came to the Granger place. Came in through the back, which isn't how you come if you're there on legitimate business. He was there for maybe 2 hours. Cora's brother didn't hear what was discussed, but he saw Hadley leave, and he saw that Granger himself walked him out, which is also not what you did with a man you'd hired for odd jobs. Silas was very still. Granger walked him out personally. That's what the brother said. Would the brother say it to a lawyer? Danny's expression shifted into something more complicated. That's the part I had to think about before I came to you. Because Cora's brother still works there, and if it got back to Granger that he'd said something, I understand that. But Cora said, and she talked to him about it, she said he's been thinking about it ever since Hadley's statement came out. It's sitting bad with him. Silas didn't push. He could see that Danny had thought about this carefully, which wasn't something Danny did with everything, and that made it worth more. "Tell Cora to tell her brother that no one's asking him to do anything," he said. "But tell him that if he decides he wants to talk to Mrs. Hawthorne or her lawyer, the door's open, that's all." Danny nodded, clearly relieved that this was where it had landed. "Yeah, okay." He started to go. Silas stopped him. "Danny, thank you for telling me." Danny shrugged in the way people did when they were more affected by something than they wanted to show. "He didn't do it," he said. "You didn't burn that barn. Anybody who spent 5 minutes around you knows that." He paused. "Well, anybody with any sense." Inchi, Cora's brother, his name was Will, and he was 19 and visibly terrified the one time Evelyn met with him quietly in the back room of the laundry, confirmed what Danny had passed along and added one more thing that he hadn't told Cora. The morning after the barn fire, Granger had come into the stable where Will was working and had been in a particular kind of mood. Not distressed, not concerned, but the specific elevated mood of a man whose plans were proceeding. He'd commented that the Hawthorne place had had some bad luck recently, and he'd said it with a smile that Will described, searching for the right words, as the wrong kind of happy. Evelyn's lawyer was a man named Cross, who practiced out of the county seat, and who had been recommended to her by the land agent Forsyth as someone who was good with complicated cases and not easily intimidated. Cross was in his 50s, lean and deliberate in the way of someone who had learned not to waste motion, and he listened to everything Evelyn had assembled with the careful, non-reactive attention of a man cataloging rather than reacting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Forsyth will testify to the motive," he said. "Reluctantly, but he will." Will's testimony about Hadley's visit places Granger and Hadley together immediately before the fire, and Granger's comment after it is circumstantial but useful. The survey documents and the land acquisition records establish the financial motive in writing. He paused. "The remaining problem is Hadley himself." "He gave a sworn statement," Evelyn said, "which means we need to crack it, not just argue around it. A jury hears a sworn eyewitness account. They anchor to it regardless of what else you put in front of them." Cross looked at her steadily. "I need Hadley to recant, or I need to demonstrate clearly in court that his statement was purchased, preferably both." "How do you demonstrate it if Hadley won't recant? We established the payment. If Granger paid him, cash, work, land, anything, there's a record somewhere, or there's someone who knows about it. Men like Hadley talk eventually. They talk to someone they trust, or they talk to someone they're drinking with, but they talk." Cross leaned back. "Who does Hadley talk to?" Evelyn didn't know, but Tom did. Tom knew Briar Creek the way men knew a place they'd lived near for 20 years without quite being part of it. The geography of who drank where, who owed who, which relationships were solid and which ones were conducted mostly in the dark. He knew that Pete Hadley, when he was in funds, drank at a place called the Meridian on the south end of town, and that his regular company there was a man named Carl Briggs, who ran a small freighting operation that was mostly legitimate and occasionally wasn't. Cross sent a man to have a conversation with Briggs that took 2 visits and reportedly a significant amount of the Meridian's whiskey inventory. What came back from those visits was not a sworn statement. Briggs was not going to court for anything, but it was information. Hadley had told him, the week before the statement was filed, that he had a job that was going to pay well enough for him to clear his debts, and then some. He'd been vague about the nature of the job, the way a man was vague about something that required vagueness. And after the statement was filed and Silas was arrested, Hadley had paid a months-long tab at the Meridian in cash, which was not how Pete Hadley typically operated. Cross took the Meridian's proprietor's account of the tab being paid, Briggs's statement about what Hadley had said, and Will's account of Hadley at the Granger property, and he built from these 3 points an argument that he and Evelyn sat with at the kitchen table in the main house 8 days before the trial. Silas was there. He'd been included in these discussions because Evelyn had insisted on it, overriding Cross's initial preference for managing clients at a distance. Lila was asleep upstairs. May had gone to bed an hour ago. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the coffee that had been reheated twice and was now well past its best. "It's not nothing," Cross said, reviewing his own notes. "The motive is documented and specific. The circumstantial evidence around Hadley is significant. The survey connection is damning to Granger in terms of establishing why he wanted this to happen." He paused. "But if Hadley holds to his statement under cross-examination, we have a problem." "He'll hold to it," Silas said. He said it without anger, just as a fact. A man who's committed that far doesn't break from courtesy. "Agreed, so I'm going to push at the inconsistencies. Hadley said he saw you walking away from the barn with a lantern. What does he describe the lantern as?" Silas thought back to the statement, which Cross had obtained a copy of. "Standard barn lantern, metal, glass chimney." "The lantern's on the Hawthorne property," Cross said to Evelyn. "What kind are they?" She frowned, thinking. "We have 4 lanterns. 2 are the standard style he described. 2 are a different style, older, smaller, the kind that attaches to a post bracket. Robert bought them years ago from a shop in Helena." She paused. "Why?" "Because if Hadley saw someone with a lantern that night, either he's describing it accurately, in which case it was one of the 2 standard ones, or he's describing what he expected a barn lantern to look like, which means he may not have actually seen what he claims to have seen." Cross made a note. "Small thing, but small things accumulate." "You think you can break him?" Silas asked. "I think I can make the jury uncertain about him. That's not the same thing, but in a criminal case it may be enough." The trial began on a Thursday. The Briar Creek Courthouse was a solid, plain structure on the main street that served as meeting hall and civic space when it wasn't serving as a courtroom. On the morning the trial opened, it was packed. Not because this was a celebrated case in any broad sense, but because in a county of this size, everything was somewhat local, and the combination of Hawthorne Ranch, Silas Boone's arrest, and Victor Granger's hovering presence in the background had given the proceedings the quality of something that touched many things at once. Victor Granger himself was there in the second row behind the prosecution. He was a big man, not tall but solid, with the wide-shouldered build of someone who had worked hard in his youth and spent his middle age directing others to do it for him. He wore a good coat. He sat with the relaxed posture of a man attending a proceeding he expected to go his way. Silas noticed him when he came in. He made himself look away. Evelyn sat in the row directly behind Silas and Cross, with Tom on one side of her and Danny on the other. Lila was with May at the ranch. Silas had been firm about that, and Evelyn had agreed without argument. Whatever happened today, Lila didn't need to be in this room. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on Hadley. Their attorney, a man named Rourke, who wore his confidence like something tailored specifically for him, walked Hadley through his statement in careful detail. Yes, he had been on the road east of the ranch. Yes, it had been close to 10 o'clock. Yes, he had seen a man walking from the direction of the barn structure with a lantern in his hand. Yes, he identified that man as Silas Boone, whose face he had seen in Briar Creek on prior occasions. Hadley told it clean and steady. He was good at this, Silas noted. Not so polished as to seem rehearsed, but organized enough to be credible. He looked at the jury when he answered. He didn't fidget. He had clearly done some version of this before, or had been coached by someone who knew how it worked. When Cross stood to cross-examine, he did it slowly. He established that the night had been dark. He established the distance from the road to the barn structure. He established the lighting conditions. A partial moon, intermittent cloud cover, no lamp on the roadside of the fence. He did this without hurry, letting each answer sit. Then he asked about the lantern. You said the man you observed was carrying a lantern. Can you describe it? Hadley described it. Standard barn lantern, metal body, glass chimney, roughly cylindrical. Cross walked to the table and picked up 2 lanterns that had been brought from the ranch. He held them up. Is this the type you saw? One was the standard type Hadley had described. The other was the older, smaller post-bracket style. Hadley pointed to the standard one without hesitation. That one. You're certain? Yes. Cross set the lanterns down. He paused. He let the pause be longer than comfortable. Then he said, Mr. Hadley, are you aware that on the evening of the fire, both standard lanterns on the Hawthorne property were inside the bunkhouse and the main house respectively, and neither had been taken out that evening prior to the fire being discovered? Hadley blinked. Something moved behind his eyes that he controlled quickly. I can only say what I saw. I understand, but if both standard lanterns were accounted for indoors, then either the man you saw was carrying a lantern that came from somewhere else, or— Cross let that sit for a moment. You didn't see what you've told this court you saw. Rourke objected. There was a brief exchange with Judge Alderman. Cross rephrased and moved on, but the point was in the air now, hanging there, and Silas watched the jury and saw 3 of them exchange a look. Cross brought Forsyth to the stand and walked him through the railroad survey and Granger's land acquisitions. Forsyth was uncomfortable and visibly wished he were somewhere else entirely, but he answered accurately, and by the time he was done, the jury had heard, in the dry and credentialed language of a professional land agent, exactly what the East pasture was actually worth, and exactly why a man of Granger's resources and ambition might consider it worth considerable effort to acquire. Will, Cora's brother, was the most difficult witness. He was young and frightened, and it showed. But his account of Hadley's visit to the Granger property and Granger's demeanor the morning after the fire was specific and unadorned, and specific and unadorned was harder to dismiss than polished certainty. When Rourke pressed him in cross-examination, he didn't elaborate or defend or back down. He just said, I know what I saw, and I know what he said, and those 2 sentences, repeated with the stubbornness of a 19-year-old who'd decided he was done being afraid, landed solidly. The tab at the Meridian came in through the proprietor, who had no stake in anything except telling what he knew, and who described Hadley's cash payment with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who remembered unusual events because they were unusual. Then Cross did something Silas hadn't expected. He called Victor Granger to the stand. Rourke was on his feet immediately. There was an extended argument at the bench that Silas couldn't fully hear, but whose energy he could feel clearly from where he sat. Judge Alderman, who had been conducting proceedings with the even-tempered attention of a man taking them seriously, listened to both sides and allowed it. Granger came to the stand with the unhurried composure of someone who had prepared for this possibility. He was polite. He was precise. He denied knowing Hadley beyond casual acquaintance. He denied any knowledge of the Barnfire's origins. He acknowledged interest in purchasing Evelyn's land, but characterized it as normal business practice. He was, Silas thought, exactly as good at this as you'd expect a man who had been operating carefully for 15 years to be. Cross let him establish all of that. Let him build the picture of a reasonable businessman with legitimate interests. Then he put the railroad survey in front of him. "Are you familiar with this document, Mr. Granger?" Granger looked at it. Something in his expression changed in a way that Silas would later have difficulty describing. Not a crack exactly, more like a very slight shift in the set of his face, as if a weight had been redistributed somewhere inside it. "It's a territorial commission filing," Granger said. "A route survey for the Great Northern Railroad expansion, projecting a likely right-of-way corridor through the eastern portion of Hawthorne Ranch. Are you familiar with its contents?" "I'm aware of railroad expansion activity in the territory generally." "That's not what I asked you." Cross's voice stayed level. "Are you familiar with the contents of this specific document?" A pause. Short, but there. "I may have seen something similar." "When?" Another pause. Longer. "I couldn't say precisely." Cross showed him the land acquisition records then, the parcels bought along the corridor, the pattern of them, the timing relative to the survey filing. He asked about each one. Granger answered carefully, and each careful answer took a little more time than the last, and the jury watched a man being asked to explain a pattern he had not prepared an innocent explanation for. He didn't break. Men like Granger didn't break in courtrooms. But he bent, in the way a structure bent before it failed, and by the time Cross released him back to his seat, the room felt different. Hadley was recalled. Cross stood in front of him for a moment and just looked at him. And something in that look, or maybe it was everything that had come before it, the accumulated weight of Forsyth and Will and the Meridian's proprietor and the survey documents and Granger's pauses, something finally shifted something in Pete Hadley that his discipline hadn't been able to hold. "Mr. Hadley," Cross said, "I'm going to ask you once more. Did you see Silas Boone near that barn on the night of the fire?" The silence in the courthouse was the specific physical kind, the kind where 40 people are all suppressing the act of breathing at the same moment. Hadley looked at his hands. He looked at the jury. He looked briefly at Granger in the second row. Granger's expression gave him nothing. "No," Hadley said. One word, flat and exhausted and true in a way that everything he'd said before had not been. The single syllable of it went through the room like something dropped from a height. "No," he said again, as if he needed to hear himself say it twice. "I didn't see him. I wasn't on that road. I was told what to say, and I was paid to say it, and I said it, and No, I didn't see him." The room came apart. Rourke was standing. Alderman was calling for order. In the second row, Victor Granger sat perfectly still for a moment that stretched too long, and then he reached up and straightened his collar in a small, mechanical gesture that had nothing to do with his collar and everything to do with a man whose machinery had just come apart and didn't yet know what to do with his hands. Silas was looking at the table in front of him. He put both palms flat against the wood and breathed. Evelyn's hand came over the railing behind him and landed on his shoulder, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say yet, and she understood, she had always understood, that not every moment needed words. Judge Alderman called for order 3 more times before he got it. Then he looked down from the bench at the courtroom that had just been reorganized by one word from a frightened paid witness who had, in the end, found some floor beneath everything he'd agreed to stand on. He turned to the jury. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. When they came back, the foreman, a rancher from the north end of the county whom Silas had never met, read the verdict in a voice that was careful and clear and left no room for anything. Not guilty. Alderman dismissed the charge. He ordered Granger held pending a criminal investigation into arson, fraud, theft, witness tampering, and conspiracy. He said it without theater, the way he did everything, as if these were simply the logical conclusions of what had occurred, as if justice were a thing that arrived by process rather than miracle. Victor Granger was standing when Alderman's gavel came down, and two men who were not his employees came to either side of him, and the expression on his face as he understood what was happening was not something Silas allowed himself to look at for long. It was too close to something he recognized, the look of a man watching everything solid dissolve beneath his feet. And even now, even after everything, he couldn't make himself feel good about watching another person wear that face. Outside the courthouse, the January sky was the kind of pale blue that came after weather had spent itself completely. Cold, but clear. The kind of sky that made no promises but didn't threaten anything either. Tom shook Silas's hand and said nothing, which was the right choice. Danny said something that Silas immediately forgot because his ears were full of a sound like water, and his eyes were stinging in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Forsyth walked past without speaking and gave a single nod that contained more complicated feeling than anything Silas had seen from the man across all their dealings. He found Evelyn at the edge of the boardwalk, looking at the street. She turned when he came to stand beside her. Her face was tired. Genuinely, deeply tired, in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. The tiredness of someone who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could finally set it down, and found that the setting down was its own kind of labor. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. They stood there in the cold January air, and neither of them moved for a while. And around them the small town of Briar Creek went on being itself, unaware mostly of the specific weight of what had just shifted, but going on regardless, the way places did. Inside Silas, something that had been pulled tight since October, since well before October, since the bank letter in August, since the third flood, since the worst winter of his life, loosened by one notch. Not gone, not finished, but one notch looser, which was enough. It was, for now, enough. They drove back from Briar Creek in the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind that settled between people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill every moment with words to prove they were still there. Tom drove the wagon. Danny sat in the back and stared at the winter landscape going by without his usual commentary. Evelyn sat beside Silas on the front bench with 6 inches of cold air between them, and the wagon wheels turned on the frozen road, and the pale January sky held everything without comment. Silas was thinking about Lila. He'd been thinking about her through most of the trial, in the background of everything else. That specific parental frequency that ran underneath whatever else was happening, a constant low signal. He thought about her curled up at the ranch with May, probably asking questions May was pretending to find annoying. He thought about the piece of braided rope she slept with, twisted into knots in the mornings. He thought about what he was going to tell her when he got back, and how much of the truth fit inside a 5-year-old's understanding, and how much he already understood anyway, without being told. The ranch appeared ahead as the road curved. The main house, the rebuilt barn still showing pale new timber against the dark of the older structures, the stable, the fence lines running out into the winter fields, smoke from the kitchen chimney, a lamp already burning in the window though it was barely past afternoon. May was on the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. She looked at their faces, Tom's, Danny's, Evelyn's, Silas's, and whatever she read there made her close her eyes for just a moment in a way that wasn't dramatic but was absolutely real. "Lila's inside," she said to Silas. "She's been asking me every 20 minutes since noon." He was off the wagon before it had fully stopped. Lila hit him somewhere around the middle of the porch steps. She'd come through the front door fast and caught him still moving, and he grabbed her up and she locked both arms around his neck with the total physical commitment of a child who has been worried for a long time and has run completely out of patience for it. "You came back," she said into his collar. "I told you I would." "I know, but you were gone so long." He held her out at arm's length so he could see her face. She looked at him with eyes that were wet at the corners and determined not to be, which was so specifically her that it made something ache in his chest. "It's over," he said. "All of it. We're not going anywhere." She studied him for a moment the way she always studied him when she was deciding whether to believe something. Then she wrapped her arms back around his neck, and he carried her inside. The weeks that followed were strange in the way aftermath was always strange. The sudden absence of something you'd been braced against for so long that the absence itself felt like a new kind of pressure. Granger's arrest had moved through the county like weather, reshaping things as it went. The criminal investigation Cross had described moved slowly, the way investigations did, but it moved. Charges were being built. The stolen cattle, a portion of them, at least, traced through a buyer in the county south of Briar Creek, who had no idea they were stolen, were recovered and returned. Pete Hadley cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges and left the county sometime in February without saying goodbye to anyone. The town's relationship with Silas shifted in the way that was harder to accept than the hostility had been. Hostility was at least clean. What replaced it was something messier. Men who had crossed the street to avoid him in December now nodding in the street, or stopping to shake his hand with an enthusiasm that had more than a little discomfort running underneath it. The general store owner in Briar Creek, a man named Garrett, who had refused to extend credit to Evelyn during the worst of the rumors, came to the ranch in February with a covered dish his wife had made and a speech about misjudgment that he clearly found painful to deliver. Silas stood on the porch and let him deliver it. When Garrett was done, Silas said, "It's all right, Mr. Garrett." "It's not all right," Garrett said, which was the same thing Evelyn had said in front of the courthouse in January. And hearing it from Garrett's mouth made Silas think about how many different things those 3 words could carry depending on who said them. "No," he agreed, "but I appreciate you coming." Garrett left his wife's dish. It was a beef pie, and it was very good, and drove his wagon back to town, and Silas stood on the porch and watched him go and thought about the mechanics of being forgiven by people who hadn't done enough wrong to require serious forgiveness, but had done enough to require acknowledgement. He thought it was one of the stranger things humans asked of each other. Lila appeared at his elbow. She did this, materialized beside him without any audible approach, which he still hadn't gotten used to. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Someone who wanted to say sorry." "What for?" He looked at her. She was wearing her coat buttoned wrong. She always skipped the second button, and her hair needed combing. She looked solid and healthy and entirely herself, which, after the fever and the months of walking and everything that had come after, was the most remarkable thing he could think of. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Come on. May's gonna want that dish before we eat it ourselves." In March, Evelyn sat down with 2 representatives from the Great Northern Railroad, who had traveled from the territorial capital in a rented coach and arrived at the ranch with the careful, slightly overpolished manner of men who needed something and knew it. She had Cross with her. She had the survey documents she'd found in the records office. She had, most importantly, a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what her land was worth to them, which was a different number than what it had been worth to Granger, and a different number still from what the railroad men had started the conversation hoping she believed. The negotiation took 4 hours and 2 pots of coffee. May circled the kitchen with the expression of someone who found the whole proceeding faintly entertaining. Tom sat in on the early portion at Evelyn's request and said almost nothing, which was, she had come to understand, often more useful than a great deal of talk. What emerged from those 4 hours was not a sale. Evelyn was not selling her land. What emerged was a right-of-way agreement, a negotiated corridor through the eastern edge of the property, at a price per acre that was fair and that came with binding terms about construction timelines and restoration of any disturbed pasture, and a lump sum payment that would allow the ranch to put new buildings on the south property and expand the breeding operation they'd been planning since before Granger had made expanding anything feel like an impossible luxury. When the railroad men drove away in their rented coach, Evelyn stood in the yard and looked east at the pasture in the afternoon light. The same pasture Granger had spent years trying to take, that he had committed crimes to acquire, that had brought everything down around all their heads. It was good land. She'd always known it was good land. She just hadn't known precisely how good. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. She felt tired in a way that was different from exhaustion, more like the feeling after a long physical task is complete, when your muscles have done everything they had, and the job is done, and you can finally just stand still and breathe. Silas came to stand beside her. He'd been working the south fence line all afternoon, and there was mud on his boots and his coat, and a scratch along his left hand from a wire he'd grabbed wrong. He looked at the pasture, too. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. "We keep the land. We get fair compensation for the right-of-way. Construction starts in the fall." He nodded slowly. Robert would have been good with that. She glanced at him. It was not the kind of thing he said easily or often, and she knew that. "Yes," she said, "he would have." They stood there for a moment in the March cold, and the thing that had been building between them since October, and since the gate, since the barn, since the courtroom, since every moment of those months that had required them to stand next to each other against something, was present in the air in a way that neither of them had quite named yet. Not because they didn't recognize it, but because some things needed to settle before you could look at them directly. It was Lila who precipitated it, in the way that children sometimes drove things toward their natural conclusions without any sense of either their power or their effect. It was an evening in April, past Lila's bedtime, and Silas had been carrying her up the stairs when she said, from somewhere near his shoulder, "Is Evelyn going to be our family?" He stopped on the third step. "What makes you ask that?" he said carefully. "May says she thinks so." Lila's voice was already getting drowsy, going soft at the edges. "I told May I thought so too." Silas stood on the third step for a moment. "When did you and May have this conversation?" "Lots of times," Lila said, as if this were obvious. "May talks to me while I help her in the kitchen." He carried her the rest of the way up and got her settled and tucked the blanket around her and found the piece of braided rope where it had fallen between the mattress and the wall and put it back in her hand. She was asleep before he'd reached the door. He stood in the upstairs hallway for a minute, looking at the wall. Then he went back downstairs. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the account books. She'd been doing the spring planning, which involved more arithmetic than the winter planning, and always put a particular kind of focused tension between her eyebrows. She looked up when he came in. He sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Lila asked me tonight if you were going to be our family," he said. Evelyn set her pen down. Her expression shifted into something he couldn't fully read, but it wasn't surprise. "What did you tell her?" "I told her May talks too much." Something crossed Evelyn's face that was the closest he'd seen her come to a genuine, unguarded smile. It changed everything about how she looked. Not in the way stories described it, not like a transformation, just like a door opening slightly and something warmer coming through. "May," she said, "is not wrong about very many things." Silas looked at her. "I want to say this right," he said, "and I'm not sure I know how to say it right. So I'm just going to say it the way I know. All right, I came through your gate with nothing, with a sick child and a broken boot and enough failure behind me to fill a field. You opened the gate. You didn't have to. You didn't know me. And everything that's happened since, the work, the trouble, all of it. I wouldn't trade any of it, because all of it brought me to sitting here across from you." He paused. "I'm not a man with much to offer. I have what I can work for and what I can build. And I'll work and build until I'm not able to anymore. And Lila," Evelyn said quietly, "has been part of this household since October. That's not in question." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to marry me, Evelyn, plainly, without a lot of ornamentation around it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April wind moved against the window. The particular sound of Montana spring that was still cold, but carried something different in it than winter cold. The suggestion, at least, of what was coming. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions about how things should be run, and I'm usually right about them, and I'm not good at pretending otherwise. I don't stop working when I should. I held this ranch together by being stubborn about everything, and I don't know how to turn that off at the door." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you for 6 months. And I'm asking you to marry me." She looked at him for a long moment, the same way she'd looked at him through the locked gate in the October rain, measuring, deciding, seeing what was actually there rather than what she feared or hoped. "Yes," she said. It was a plain word, delivered plainly, which was right. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed that way for a while at the kitchen table with the account book spread around them, which was, in its own way, completely appropriate. They married in June, when the ranch was fully in its summer operation and the new barn had lost its pale newness and the railroad surveying crews had begun their preliminary work along the eastern corridor. The ceremony was small. Tom stood up for Silas, May stood up for Evelyn, and Lila wore a dress May had made for her from blue cotton and sat in the front with the solemn, important expression of a 6-year-old who has been given a serious responsibility and intends to carry it correctly. Danny cried, which he denied afterward and which everyone present saw. The wedding was not a perfect day. The weather turned in the late afternoon and brought rain that hadn't been forecast, which soaked the yard where they'd planned to eat dinner outside and forced everyone inside in a scramble that knocked over 2 chairs and spilled a pitcher of cider. May burned the bottom of the wedding cake because she'd been talking to Tom about something and forgot to check it. Lila stepped on the hem of her dress during the ceremony, and there was a tearing sound at a moment that was supposed to be quiet. None of it mattered. All of it was real, which was better than perfect. Victor Granger was convicted in September on 4 counts: arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and witness tampering. He received a sentence that meant he would not return to the county for many years, possibly ever. His holdings, accumulated through 15 years of careful and sometimes criminal operation, were attached as part of the proceedings and sold. The land he had acquired along the railroad corridor, the parcels he'd spent so much and done so much to collect, went to auction and sold to 3 different buyers, none of whom were him. Silas heard about the conviction from Tom, who had ridden into Briar Creek for supplies and come back with the news. He was working the south pasture when Tom found him, and he listened and he nodded and he went back to work. Tom watched him for a moment. "That's all you've got." Silas drove a post another 2 inches. "What do you want me to say?" Most men would have something more to say about the man who tried to put them in prison. Silas stopped and looked at Tom. He thought about it genuinely. About Granger. About the months of targeted damage. About the night he'd been arrested in front of Lila and her face when they'd taken him. About the courtroom and the long weeks before it. He wanted land, Silas said. He wanted it so badly he made it the whole of everything. Gave up whatever else he might have had for the sake of a piece of Montana pasture. He picked up the maul. And now he's got nothing, and the land's still there. He shrugged. That seems like enough. Tom considered this. Maybe, he said. Then he rode on, and Silas went back to the fence. Years passed the way years did. Not evenly, not without difficulty, but steadily, which was its own kind of grace. The railroad came through in the following year, and the right-of-way construction was disruptive in the way all construction was disruptive. Noise and machinery and strangers moving through land that had been private, fences temporarily down and then back up, the routine of the ranch bent around an outside schedule for months. It was worth it. The compensation funded the south property expansion, 2 new breeding stallions, and a bunkhouse large enough that Tom stopped complaining about the one they had. Evelyn learned over time that Silas was as stubborn as she was, which led to arguments that were occasionally spectacular and always resolved, because underneath the stubbornness in both of them was the same bedrock thing, a willingness to stay, to work it out, to not walk away. That willingness was something neither of them had with everyone. With each other, it was simply present, and they were both experienced enough to know what that was worth. Lila grew. That was the simplest way to say it, and also the most accurate. She grew into a girl who could gentle a horse nearly as well as her father, who asked May questions that continued to be genuinely difficult to answer, who had strong opinions about the correct way to do everything and the social confidence to share them, which Evelyn recognized with a mixture of recognition and private amusement. A daughter came. They named her Rose, which was Evelyn's mother's name, and she arrived in the world with a set of opinions about everything that she communicated at maximum volume until she'd satisfied herself that the world was paying adequate attention. Lila took her role as older sister with tremendous seriousness and somewhat less patience, which was honest and also fine. May, who had announced several times that she was too old for this level of activity, showed no signs whatsoever of slowing down. Tom's hair went all the way to gray and then to white, and he cut his beard off one spring for reasons he declined to explain and that no one pressed him on. Edgar left to start his own operation in the valley south of Briar Creek, and they hired a young man named Hector to replace him, who was 22 and worked harder than 3 men and had the useful quality of not talking much until he had something worth saying. Danny. Danny got married to Cora, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. and they settled in Briar Creek and had 2 children quickly. And Danny came out to the ranch on weekends for years the way people came back to places that had mattered to them during important times, which was to say, he came back because the place had been part of something real. There was a morning, maybe 7 or 8 years after the night Silas had pounded on the locked gate in the October rain, when he was out on the east pasture before sunrise, checking the fence line along the railroad corridor. The sky was the dark blue that came just before light, and the grass was heavy with dew, and somewhere out of sight on the main road a wagon was moving, the sound of it traveling clear in the still morning air. He stopped and stood still for a moment, the way he sometimes did out here, just taking in the specific quality of the silence that wasn't really silence. The sounds of the ranch behind him, the horses in the stable, somewhere Lila's voice carrying across the yard, the particular smell of the land in early morning. He thought, not for the first time, about the version of himself who had walked through this county with a sick child and 70 cents, and no plan worth the name. That man had been carrying such weight, the farm, the bank, Clara, the months of moving. He'd been so stripped down that he'd had nothing left to protect him from anything, which had turned out, in ways he hadn't seen coming, to be a kind of freedom. When you had nothing, you had no reason not to knock on a locked gate at midnight. When you had nothing, a woman with a lantern who opened that gate without asking who you were was the whole world. He didn't know what he believed about how things worked, whether there was design in it or just the accumulation of small decisions made under pressure. He suspected it was mostly the latter. He suspected that what had happened wasn't fate, but the consequence of a series of choices. Evelyn's choice to unlock the gate, his choice to keep walking toward it, her choice to stay when Granger came, his choice to not vanish when things went hard, her choice to spend 6 weeks in county records offices with a thread and pull it until it unraveled. Choices under pressure were the realest kind, because they showed you what a person was made of when the surface had been removed. What Evelyn was made of, he had learned, was considerable. What he was made of, he was still finding out. He thought that was probably true for most people for most of their lives, and that the finding out, while not comfortable, was at least honest. Lila's voice again, closer now. He turned and saw her coming across the pasture toward him with 2 cups of something hot, picking her way across the dew-wet grass with the confident stride of a girl who had grown up on this land and knew every inch of it. She was 12 now, tall. She had her mother Clara's coloring and some of Silas's stubbornness and some quality all her own that he couldn't trace to anyone. She reached him and handed him one of the cups. Coffee. She'd been making the morning coffee herself for a year, which had been Evelyn's idea and had met with initial resistance from May that gradually softened as Lila's coffee turned out to be, in fact, better than May's, a fact May acknowledged exactly once and never repeated. "Evelyn says breakfast is ready," Lila said. "I'll be in." She stood next to him and looked out at the pasture the way he'd been looking at it. After a moment, she said, "You do this every morning. Just stand here." "I know." "What are you looking at?" He thought about how to answer that. "Everything," he said. "Just everything." She accepted this without requiring further explanation, which was one of the things about her that he was most grateful for. They stood there together in the early morning on the east pasture, the ranch behind them coming fully awake in the first light, and the sky going from blue to gold along the eastern ridge, and the day beginning the way days did, without announcement, without ceremony, just light finding the land and the land receiving it. He drank his coffee. It was good. He turned back toward the house, and Lila walked beside him, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney was already rising against the January sky, straight up, which meant still air, which meant a clear day ahead. That was the thing about Hawthorne Ranch, the thing that travelers and buyers and railroad men and neighbors came to understand over the years, sometimes without being able to say it directly. It wasn't the land, though the land was good. It wasn't the breeding operation, though the horses were excellent, or the cattle numbers, or the railroad money. It was something about the place itself, a quality in how it was run, how it held the people in it, how it had been tested and had not broken. A locked gate, opened. A lantern in the rain. A woman who looked at a man with nothing and saw something worth seeing. Those things didn't announce themselves at the time. They rarely did. They only became visible later, when you stood far enough back to see the whole shape of what had grown from them. The barn, the family, the children, The years of work. The land that had been fought for and held and would be held still, long after the people who had fought for it were gone. Silas came through the kitchen door and the warmth of the house came out to meet him. And Evelyn looked up from the stove, and Rose made a loud and urgent sound from the corner that suggested she had been waiting for breakfast with diminishing patience. And somewhere behind him the door swung shut against the morning cold. He hung his coat. He sat down at the table. He looked at his family. It wasn't a perfect life. The ranch had bad years, and the marriage had hard stretches, and the children were difficult in the specific ways that children were difficult, and the work was never finished, and the weather was never fully predictable, and every fixed thing eventually needed fixing again. But it was his. It was theirs. It had been built from a knock on a locked gate and a woman who chose, without enough information and without any guarantee, to open it. That was the whole of it, really. That was the thing worth carrying. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't fighting or enduring or holding on. Sometimes it was just opening the gate.